All right, everyone. It is 9 o'clock by my watch, my clock. So I think we are going to go ahead and get started. I don't have a particularly great handle on how many to expect. I think 37 are registered, but that could be for any of the four coffee and chat sessions for Forest Pest First Detectors. So I just want to start out really quickly with an introduction. So my name is Angie Gupta, University of Minnesota Extension Forester, and I'm the one who typically signs the communications, the emails that you guys get. And I'm here representing the Forest Pest First Detector team. So I'm going to have Matt introduce himself quickly, and then Monica, and then I saw Sasha on here and Gary. So we'll introduce some of the instructors for Forest Pest First Detectors. I'll start first with Matt.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Matt Russell. I'm an extension specialist, University of Minnesota, and happy to be here and a part of this Forest Pest First Detector team.
Excellent. Matt, I'm going to go to Monica, and then after Monica, Sasha, and then Gary Wyatt.
Good morning. I'm Monica Chandler. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I'm in the Noxious and Invasive Weed program, and I'm happy to be here talking about weeds this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Monica. And so she's our guest expert for today. So Sasha, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sasha Lodge with the Minnesota DNR in the Division of Forestry. I am the Terrestrial Invasive Species Program Coordinator and just relatively new to this position, so just joined this group.
Awesome. Thank you, Sasha. We're excited to have you as a new member of the Forest Pest First Detector team. And Gary, you're next. And then if anyone else is on the team that I don't see, raise your hand after Gary or speak up.
Hi, Gary Wyatt. Glad to be here. Extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, helping Matt and Angie around the state with invasive species. I focus on agroforestry, invasive species, and bioenergy with willows and hybrid poplars. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. And so just a little bit of background as a few more people continue to join us this morning. So Forest Pest First Detector has for many years had both an online component and an in-person component. And for the last probably 4 years, it's been a flipped classroom. So mostly online with an in-person workshop. And of course, and in 2020, we didn't have that. So we had made a decision in late 2019, so pre-pandemic decision actually, to not have a traditional Forest Pest First Detector program in 2020, and instead to try some other citizen science invasive species type programming. And then the pandemic happened. And so I will just say I was immensely grateful that we had made that programmatic decision and we were not scheduled to have our traditional workshops because they would have definitely been canceled. And so, so last year was really a different year for us. There were several citizen science projects that happened, but no traditional Forest Pest First Detector workshop as we've become accustomed. The intent was never to let it go away. So when we had to think about what to do for 2021, realizing we still have all of the social distancing requirements of the pandemic are still in practice at the university, we sent a survey out to you, Forest Pest First Detectors, and we asked, and you answered. So we are trying to do our best to be responsive to what you said you needed and wanted. And so this is our effort of that. So this is the first of 4 series that will happen Wednesdays once a month through June. The subject areas are what you as First Detectors defined or identified as important to you. And we did our best to get continuing ed credit, which you also very clearly stated was important. You also picked Wednesday morning at 9 as your preferred time. So in an effort to be responsive and still offer you something, this is what we're doing. We have not taken off of the table to do a fall workshop. That is still a possibility. We'll have to just see where things land. There was interest in doing a spring workshop, and I'll just tell you that the leaders and the instructors did not feel like they would be able to get permission to do that, given the current COVID restrictions that all of us are operating under professionally. So with that, I will, dive in. I will ask any of my instructors, anybody think I missed anything this morning in our intro?
I'll just add really quickly, Angie, for those of you that want CEU credits, we have CEUs for SAF, Minnesota Forest Stewardship Plan Writer, and ISA. We'll give that link at the end of the webinar for you to fill out. So just a quick update on that, Angie.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. And Matt made the really keen observation that we forgot to ask you to tell us your name. So if you want credit, you need to type your name in the comments or we won't know who to give credit to. So that is our oversight and we will try to fix that for the next sessions.
And Angie, these will be recorded and posted somewhere, right?
Yeah, excellent question, Gary. So I'm a little embarrassed. It did not occur to me to sort that out until someone asked. But indeed, we are going to have these things. They are being recorded. It is being recorded. We'll clip off the beginning and end where it's maybe not so interesting. And then we will post that to YouTube as soon as all of that is done. And I don't think it should take more than a day or two. I will then send a note out to Forest Pest First Detectors who were unable to make today. And we should be able to get them credit for that. So great question, Gary. Anybody else think I missed something before we get started? Okay, so we were not sure how many folks to expect, so I'm not going to go around the horn and ask everyone to introduce yourselves, but this is meant to be a discussion. So I know Monica has a few slides that she's going to share with us, so we're going to go through those. And then after that, it really is intended to be a Q&A and a discussion. And so if you are comfortable, you can raise, we'll have to see how it goes. If it feels like it's getting kind of messy, raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can unmic and you can speak. If it's not super robust and you can just unmic and speak without it talking over each other, that can also work. And then when you do that, please tell us who you are. Give us your name, what you do, and why you care about these invasive species. And then if you're not comfortable unmiking or that's not a good choice for you, you are welcome to type into the chat, either to me or to Matt personally, or to the group, and we will try to field those questions in that way. So, and people are welcome to turn their video on. I think it is better for a robust discussion. If you have internet problems or that doesn't feel good for you, then don't worry about it. But I do think having your video on makes for a better discussion, maybe particularly later. All right. So with that, Monica, I am going to share my screen. And I only have one today. I don't think we have any sound, but just in case. And then okay, I realize this isn't what you want to see. There we go. What you can't see are all these little Zoom things that pop up over, and it makes it a little hard. Okay, so with this, we are here again for the Minnesota Noxious Weed List presentation, and this is part of the Forest Pest First Detector Coffee and Chat Zoom meetings. And so a little housekeeping introduction. Please mute when you're not speaking. That will make it better for everyone. Questions can be typed into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can unmute. And, all right, there we go. And so with that, Monica, you just let me know when I need to advance the slides, and it is all you.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to talk about noxious weeds, a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I'll introduce myself again in case there are some people who joined recently. My name is Monica Chandler, and I'm with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture in the Noxious and Invasive Weed Program. So when we think about noxious weeds, I like to start with this overarching purpose of the noxious weed law. So the noxious weed list fits within the noxious weed law. And so here is the purpose of the weed law. The Department of Agriculture does not own any land at all in the state. So this is all about protecting the residents of Minnesota from the injurious effects of noxious weeds. So those effects can include public health, the environment, public roads, crops, livestock, and other property. So this is the mandate that we work under. Next slide, please. So the noxious weed list is a list of specific species, plant species, that are determined by the Commissioner of Agriculture to be noxious. And so what does noxious mean? It means that these are regulated plant species. So there's a lot of terminology with plants. For example, we use the term invasive plant, which is a non-native plant that does harm. We also use the term nuisance species that maybe they're native, but they can be a little aggressive. We can think of something like goldenrod. And so what we're talking about here today are noxious weeds, which are plant species that are regulated. So within the noxious weed list, there are different categories there, and we'll go into these categories a little bit more in the next few slides, but they are prohibited eradicate, prohibited control, restricted, and specially regulated plant. Enforcement, I did not plan to cover extensively today, but we can certainly talk about that in the discussion if there's interest. But the county is the lead on enforcement. So there are county agricultural inspectors that lead enforcement. There are township supervisors, township officers, and then municipalities can also have local weed inspectors. So the townships and municipalities have local weed inspectors that work with their county ag inspector on enforcement of this weed law. Next slide, please. So now we'll go more into the specific categories. So the category of weeds that are considered the highest priority are prohibited eradicate. And what this means is that all plant parts must be destroyed. And so these are highly damaging species. We know this because they've been really bad actors in other areas. And so our goal is to eradicate them from Minnesota, that their distribution is very limited. And you can see this example here with black swallowwort. On the right, there's a map of Minnesota, and the purple dots are locations of black swallowwort infestations. So very, very small. And it seems like it would be really easy to eradicate, but new infestations keep popping up, and this is a very, very sneaky plant. So it turns out to be quite difficult to eradicate. But as you can see, these are not extensive and widespread infestations, and the best thing we can do for Minnesota is to eradicate them before they get out of hand. So some examples are black swallowwort, oriental bittersweet, and tree of heaven. And tree of heaven has an additional importance that you'll learn about more with the presentation on spotted lanternfly, because it's an important host for spotted lanternfly. So not only do we not want tree of heaven because it's a very invasive, aggressive plant, on its own, but additionally, it's a host of spotted lanternfly. So it has two marks against it there. Next slide, please. Prohibited control is the next category. So these are species that are more widely distributed. We are not going to be able to get rid of them. We're going to have to live with them. So the goal is really to prevent them from spreading. And that can be with methods such as if you have Canada thistle on your property, you could carefully time the mowing so that there is not mature seed produced, and you would be in compliance with the noxious weed law. So examples of prohibited control species include wild parsnip, common tansy, and Japanese knotweed. Next slide, please. Restricted is the next category. And in this case, the plants that are on the restricted list, these species cannot be planted or sold. And this is really to prevent increasing the number of infestations through planting. So these are highly damaging species. You're probably familiar with many of them. Some examples include common buckthorn, non-native honeysuckles, and garlic mustard. So there's no requirement to control these species, and that's in large part because they are so extensive in their infestations that they have the potential to really just be impossible for some landowners to be required to control them. Next slide, please. Specially regulated plant is a really neat category. I'm so glad that we have it. So this is a place on the noxious weed list where species that don't fit well into the other categories can be regulated here in this specially regulated category. So some examples of why this is important is that a species could be native, or it could be very valuable for some purpose. And so perhaps regulation could be crafted to allow it to be used for its important purpose, but not have the damaging impacts. So the specificity with which we can regulate in this category is really terrific, and I think many states lack this kind of flexibility. So some examples include poison ivy, which is native to Minnesota. It has a lot of wildlife benefits, but the regulations are written so that a landowner must control poison ivy if the public is going to come in contact with this. So for example, if you're a store owner and outside of your store along the walkway, you have poison ivy, you could be required to control that. Amur maple is another example, and that is where there is a label at the point of sale stating that Amur maple cannot be planted within 100 yards of a natural area. And that's a less than perfect regulation, but the intent is that seed will not be blown into natural areas so that Amur maple will not naturalize. But that wasn't a science-based decision. A lot of these decisions, we operate on the best information that we have, but we often lack complete information. So we don't actually know exactly how far Amur maple seed can fly. And then winged burning bush is an example of a species that is in a phase out. So there's a 3-year production phase out of burning bush. And after that, burning bush will then move to the restricted list so that you can no longer buy and sell burning bush. So that's phase outs can be really important for industry because some of these plants are important crops for them. And when they have them in production, that would be a big economic loss to industry. So that's important to us too. Next slide, please. So how do these decisions get made about what species are on the noxious weed list? Fortunately, we have an advisory committee. So there's a noxious weed advisory committee that advises the Commissioner of Agriculture about what species should be regulated and how they should be regulated, and then also about policy and procedures. And in order to consider the different interests in Minnesota, this is a large group of people with that represent very diverse entities. And so they represent conservation, business, tribes, and government interests. So there can be farming groups and Department of Natural Resources, and we all come together, and that way we hear the different voices about noxious weed issues. Next slide, please. So there's a process to listing these plants. The process involves assessment, assessment is extensive. That is a long and detailed process. And then there is a recommendation based upon the assessment. And then there is a vote. So committee members vote, and they vote on specific recommendations. And then those recommendations are presented to the Commissioner of Agriculture, who can decide to accept or reject the recommendation. So I'm going to just take a sip here. So for the assessment process, a risk assessment document is really the backbone of the assessment process. So what we do is a lot of information gathering. We look at where is the species native to, and where is it now in the US, in Minnesota, perhaps in other countries. And we try to get a handle on whether it's established here or likely to establish here. And then we look at how problematic is this species. If it's not a problematic species, we're not interested in regulating it. So we really look at what kind of damage is done. Is it economic damage? Is it damage to natural areas? And where is this damage occurring? And then we also look at the likelihood of control. If a species were regulated a certain way, what would be the outcome? And then a recommendation is made, and that's the recommendation that goes to the commissioner if the full committee votes to support that recommendation. Next slide, please. And that'll wrap things up here as far as a presentation. So I don't have a lot of slides because I'm hoping that this is very discussion oriented. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions or hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Monica. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone again, but if we need it, I can definitely pull it up at a different time. And so with that, Matt, there have been chats I haven't been looking at. Are there any questions in the chats that we could start with?
Yeah, there are lots of questions already there. Rick had mentioned he ran into lanternfly in Pennsylvania and saw a parking lot covered with them, and sure don't want them here. So definitely an interesting comment there. A comment or a question from Jason on Amur maple. Are there large infestations of it?
There are some extensive infestations of Amur maple. I've mostly seen them in Washington County. There have been infestations reported in some other states too, but Bellwin Nature Conservancy has been dealing with some pretty extensive infestations of Amur maple. And we're starting to see Amur maples. It's an interesting plant. I think it's one of the most beautiful small trees that could be used in landscape. So personally, I was really sad when learning that this plant could be invasive. So we are starting to see it cropping up in grasslands as well as forested areas. It does pretty well in a wide range of light conditions. So it's on the move. I would say it's not, we don't have the extensive infestations of something like common buckthorn. And so hence this regulation to try and keep it in managed landscapes only. So for example, if you have your Amur maple planted in an area where there's a lawn and the seedlings fall to the lawn and then you're mowing, you're probably unlikely to see an infestation arise from that. It's really the seed moving off of those sites that's the concern.
Great. It looks like Doreen had a follow-up question. Doreen, did you want to unmute and ask, or?
Sure. I was curious. I know years ago I had gotten my Amur maple from the county as part of the distribution programs, and I'm wondering if that has now stopped in light of this information.
That's a great question. Yes, the counties, because Amur maple, you don't want to plant it near natural areas. It used to be planted for like wildlife and stuff and shelter belts, and so that use of Amur maple has stopped. But it is legal to sell Amur maple, and there is some work. This is ultimately where I'd love to see things go with ornamental plants that currently have the ability to escape. There is some work on trying to create Amur maple that is either low seeding or no seeding, so that we could retain Amur maple as this incredibly beautiful ornamental plant, but have safe varieties of it. So there is a lot going on with plant breeding right now, which is really exciting. But woody plant breeding is a long and slow process. And so unfortunately, we don't get these new varieties as quickly as we want to see them.
Yeah, it looks like Jason had some comments. Jason is in Stearns County. He says that Stearns County SWCD has not sold any Amur maple since the late 1990s. So interesting comment from Jason.
Yeah, sounds like they were ahead of us.
Yeah, and Spares comments, lives and works in Washington County, no shortage of Amur maple. It spreads quite well. So yeah, it sounds like from the east side of the state too, there's Amur maple. It looked like, Rick, you had a question about species getting taken off the list. Did you want to unmute and ask that?
Yeah, I just was wondering, I'm thinking of species like buckthorn that's getting so pervasive. Is there a point at which you just take them off the list?
Another really good question. So we have taken a couple of species off the list. So musk thistle and bull thistle have both come off the list because we were finding that having these species regulated really wasn't making a difference. Now, there are some counties that do regulate musk thistle because in the southeast, there are problems with musk thistle, but it wasn't as much of a statewide problem. So those species were delisted. There are conversations about Canada thistle that occur regularly about could Canada thistle be delisted because it is so widespread that is regulation really making a difference. And in that case, like the risk assessment was basically saying do not list. But there were farm advocacy groups that very much wanted to keep Canada thistle on the noxious weed list, and they have very good reasons for that. That you know, if Canada thistle is spreading from one person's pasture into another, that can be very problematic. So they had a really good point about how it helps in their communities to keep Canada thistle on the list. Now, buckthorn is really, really interesting, and Matt and I and several other people, Angie, many other people, have done some research on buckthorn distribution and found that there are areas where buckthorn is really, it's dense, it's, you know, really, really widespread. And then there are other areas of the state where buckthorn is not, does not exist, or like there are no confirmed reports of buckthorn in Cook County, which is the tip of the arrowhead. So if you think about Grand Marais area, there are no confirmed reports of common buckthorn there. So when we look at this on a statewide level, we very much want to keep people from selling and planting buckthorn. And there are people who do want to do this. There's a variety called fine line buckthorn that's supposed to produce less seed. And we still get requests like, well, can I sell this here? And the answer continues to be no. And I think we need to keep that answer no. But yeah, that's part of it, because I think buckthorn's a great example for why a species can be restricted. So we don't want to go out and plant more buckthorn, but you can understand how for some landowners that are just dealing with these massive infestations, it would bankrupt them to try to control all of the buckthorn on their property. So hence why that restricted category is there.
It looked like Rick also asked about Japanese lilac. Are they likely to be added to the regulated list?
Boy, that is a hot topic. Japanese tree lilac. That's a great question. So it is in the risk assessment process right now. There are very few reported infestations of Japanese tree lilac. So if there are infestations that are out there, we are quite interested in learning about them. We're also really interested in learning more about the fecundity. So the amount of seed that Japanese tree lilac varieties produce, because there are some varieties that produce very, very little seed, and there are other varieties that produce a lot of seed. So, so Japanese tree lilac is a very, very important species to industry. Part of our risk assessment process is we survey industry. So nursery and landscapes through the Minnesota Nursery Landscape Association, and then anyone who holds a nursery certificate in Minnesota. So we sent out a survey to them, and we heard back that Japanese tree lilac is a very, very important plant. So I don't know how this risk assessment will come out, but I think it's a really interesting case to look at and see the complexity of these different issues. So it's hard to say what the outcome will be, but we'll have to stay tuned for that. Maybe we could talk again in
Can I add to that? Can I
Sure.
add? Yeah, because I've had experience with this. We have a couple areas on our townhome association where we had prairie restoration install some prairie grasses to solve some other problems. And the Japanese lilac is our biggest control problem because it keeps seeding in so heavily.
So that is where, if we could get that documented. So we predominantly utilize EDMAPS, which is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. So it's a free database that's used in North America to track a number of different invasive species. And so when we get reports of Japanese tree lilac, we go to, we'll look at those EDMAPS reports then as a part of the risk assessment process. So if there are problems occurring and we don't hear about them, they don't go into the risk assessment. But if we can see documented infestations, that helps us understand the magnitude of the problem and trying to then craft the right regulation to try to deal with escapes.
Thank you. Angie,
So, yeah, I would like
to get my contact information for that. Because we got it right here in Elk River.
And I would like to just jump in generally. So I was thinking I would share, but I don't think I'm quite ready yet. So last year I ran 5 different citizen science projects related to invasive species. A couple of them were kind of find and report. So squill, oak wilt, and Norway maple were essentially be on the lookout and report this through EDMAPS. It turns out this year I'm going to do one on Japanese tree lilac. And so it will be a find and report kind of project. And so it's not exactly ready to launch completely. It will be. The plan is that we will start pushing it out to people when Japanese tree lilac is in bloom. It's really important. We do not want people to report planted and tended trees. So there are a lot of Japanese tree lilacs in boulevards and in yards in Rochester, for sure. And we don't want those reported. Those are tended, those are often loved, those are planned for. But they're very easy to identify when they have flowers. They're very conspicuous. And so we're going to ask people to pay attention to the natural areas around where those trees are when they're in flower. Because frankly, I mean, Rick can add his 2 cents here. They're fairly inconspicuous in the forest. So there are some key identification characteristics, but they are not terribly noteworthy in the forest. And so they're really easy to miss. And I did some forest restoration work over the summer when we were all stuck at home because of COVID. And I will tell you, I was working on a hill slope that was mostly completely invaded with honeysuckle and buckthorn. And it also had some other things like dame's rocket and garlic mustard. But here was what I found to be shocking. I documented over 100 different Japanese barberry seedlings, and some of them under complete full shade, right underneath that canopy of buckthorn and honeysuckle. And so it was concerning for me. So again, there will be a project. I will send that out to all the forest pest first detectors. We will start pushing it when Japanese tree lilac is in bloom, which I think is May. And then the idea, though, that we want you to look in those adjacent natural areas and report only the Japanese tree lilac in those adjacent natural areas. And the directions will be to report them to EDMAPS, which is how we would have you report anything. So look for that coming. It'll likely show up in your inbox in May. Thank you.
It looks like Doreen had a question on Japanese barberry, something I know you know a lot about, Monica. Did you want to ask that, Doreen?
Sure. I was just curious if for more information on the Japanese Barbary, because it's still being sold so widely that I was wondering what its standing was right now.
Sure. Yeah, Japanese barberry is another. You're bringing up these really great cases of, these are plants that are important in industry, and we've widely planted them in our landscapes, and that makes them inherently interesting. There are some other species that we don't find useful, and there's never any controversy about regulating them. But barberries have been it's important to figure out how to regulate barberries. So Japanese barberry, there are cultivars named varieties that produce less seeds. So there was research done at the University of Connecticut, and varieties that produce over 600 seeds per plant are regulated. And then varieties that were producing less than 600 seeds per plant are not regulated. So this is, again, much less than perfect regulation, but this is how regulation works. So it doesn't mean that a plant that produces 500 seeds or less per plant on average could not escape, but this was the compromise that was worked out for regulation, was to try to reduce that risk, to mitigate that risk. So instead of having a plant that produces, 1,000 seeds on average per plant, we're really trying to reduce that amount. Now, we did hear from industry that when barberry was even there was a phase out. So there was a 3-year phase out of the varieties of barberry that were being regulated. So these are the high seed producing varieties. When they were phased out, then there was just less barberry that was purchased in Minnesota and planted in general, regardless of variety. That even that act of phasing out some varieties was enough to make perhaps landscapers or individuals say, maybe I'll choose something else, maybe I'll use this neat little dogwood or something else instead. And it's interesting. So there's the legal ramifications, but there's also this much more human side of how we think about what we want to plant in our landscapes. So the current status is the high producing seed varieties are restricted. So that means you can't sell and plant those. But that's another plant that, exciting news, there are a number of plant breeders that are working on varieties that are low to no seeding barberries. So research out of University of Connecticut that went into industry. So they have a triploid, which is usually, it's considered functionally sterile. So so that's exciting.
It looked like Spare had a comment. They found patches of barberry in some of the forests at Carpenter Nature Center. Very, very nasty plant. So thanks for those comments.
Right. It's impossible to move through a barberry infestation. It's kind of amazing because a lot of the varieties that we like to put in our landscape are small and compact, and maybe they're purple leaved. And then when you're confronted with the naturalizing barberry, they're often 5 to 6 feet tall, and they're green leaved, and they're just dense, and there's no way that we could move through them. So like in Wabasha County, there were over 1,200 acres mapped of just dense barberry that used to be wooded pasture, but cattle can't move through that. And obviously there's no grass for the cattle. So that's considered essentially lost.
Well, I don't see any more questions in chat. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in chat, or you can unmute yourself. And I think we're going to ask that you raise your hand, and then I guess we can go ahead and ask you to unmute. So to raise your hand, if you click on the Participants tab on the bottom, and then you'll see the window open, and you should see it looks blue for me, and it says raise hand. So either way, kind of raise your hand or type in the chat, and we can relay your question to Monica.
While we're waiting, Monica, so I realized I don't know the answer to this, and I feel like I talk to you a lot. So you said that once a species it's gone through review, it's gone through committee discussion, and it goes for a vote into the committee before it's recommended to the commissioner. So is that a majority vote? And are those folks, like, who serves on the committee? I mean, do people lobby the committee for their votes, or is that kind of a closed group of experts?
It's not. It's meant to be a transparent process, so it shouldn't be that closed. There in weed law, there are specified members of the committee, like it'll say a representative from the Department of Natural Resources, a representative from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, two from conservation groups, and so there. That's specified in weed law as far as what the entities are. For example, there is a position open currently for extension forestry. We would like that expertise on the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. So that's all in law, and then the organizations choose their representatives, and then the representatives are formally appointed through the Secretary of State's office. And there are some steps to that. Sometimes we do get applicants through the Secretary of State's website saying that they want to represent an organization, and that organization may say, that's not who we want to represent us, we want this person. So the organization does get to choose their own representatives. And then the second part of your question was about the vote. So it's a roll call vote. So we do record how each organization votes. We put in the minutes, we put in a summary of the vote, but we do keep a record of exactly what the vote is. It's majority, but any dissent is written in a memo to the commissioner when the commissioner receives the recommendation. So we try to capture the wide range of views.
It looked like Katie had a question. Katie, would you want to unmute and ask Monica your question? It doesn't look like we have any audio, Katie. I can see that you're speaking, but can't hear you.
Matt, on my screen, raise hand is on the button for reactions, not under participant.
Good. Thanks for pointing that out, Rick. Yeah, there might be a couple ways to get there. So yeah, that reactions might get you the raise hand function as well. Thanks. Well, Katie, if still not hearing anything from you, Katie. Usually you can switch your mic, and right next to the mute button, there's a way to select your microphone. That might do it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Well, I unplugged my headphone. Must have a quirky computer, sorry. Well, my question is, I have a little woods, and our pandemic project was to clear out a lot of buckthorn. And we've certainly come to enjoy our woods even more and see more things now that we've gotten rid of a lot of the buckthorn. But one thing, and this used to be a little dairy farm, and I think the woods might have been pastured, but certainly around the woods was pastured, or the cows grazed. I think we might have something called cow parsnip, and I'm not sure if that's the same as wild parsnip. And I actually don't know if it maybe is garlic mustard. What we have is a white flower, and it's in the carrot family. I'm wondering how I could get that identified and if that's something that I need to try to get rid of.
Angie, do you want to talk about iNaturalist as one way to identify things? While you're thinking about that, you can also, so if you would like help with plant identification, you can also take pictures of the plant, and we like a lot of pictures, like the leaf, the whole plant, the stem, the flower, because all of these could be identifying characteristics, and you can email them to Arrest the Pest. And so in Angie's follow-up, we can include the Arrest the Pest email. So that's one way to have someone at the Department of Ag say, oh, this is wild parsnip, here's some information on controlling it. If it's cow parsnip, it's a native plant, but you still would want to exercise caution around it because the sap, if it gets on your skin and is exposed to light, could cause some burning. So we still would want to be careful around that plant. So it is really, it's really valuable to learn what plants are out there, and it's hard because it's hard to identify all the different plants that grow in Minnesota. Angie, you want to talk about iNaturalist as another tool for identification?
Yes, I was trying to pull it all up while you were giving me time to do that. Yeah, so there's a tips and tools of iNaturalist and EdMaps, which will be a whole 1 hour discussion that we will have. It's scheduled one of these upcoming months. But I will quickly share my screen if I can do that. All right. And so it gets a little busy here. I need to minimize some things. So hopefully you guys can see iNaturalist. I think iNaturalist is a really great tool to connect with anything that has ever lived and help you to identify that. And so I will go ahead and log in. There's a couple of different things that I think are really great about iNaturalist. It can help you do identifications very, very easily. And so I'm going to go to my project and then I'll kind of talk you through that, because I think this can be really useful if you're a woodland owner or you are a volunteer working on a site, or you're just a land manager. I think this has a lot of applicability. So this is one of my COVID projects. So this is my house, and these are all of different dots on my house. And one of the things that I like about this, so these are all, if you see here, I had made 99 observations within my property, representing 80 different species, and then I was the only observer. So I was the only one that was doing that. You can have your whole family do it. You can do it as a When We City Nature Challenge. It's a multi-county area that is the project. And so these are all of the pictures that I took. And so let me just start with this one. I am no fisher person and I do not live near water. So I was like, how on earth did this fish get to my property? What is this fish? I do not know. I'm using this fish because I am so out of water when it comes to fish. And so I was able to use iNaturalist. I did not know what it was. So I think iNaturalist works best if you use a phone. And so you download the app, you create a login, it becomes yours. And then one of the things that you can do is have it suggest a species. So I was able to take this photo, it suggested a number of species. I was able to pick the one I thought was correct, which was white sucker. And then that was confirmed. And it became research grade. So very quickly, after my son discovered it while mowing the grass, we were able to identify it and know what it was. And that same approach works for all of these things, right? So again, these are the things that I found at my house, all types of things, alive and dead, including many plants. And so I'll be honest, I inherited my manicured yard from the previous owner, and it had lots of non-native species that frankly I'm working to get rid of now. And so I had already gotten rid of the Japanese Barberry that we inherited and some other, truly invasive species. But as I learned more about the origin of many of these species, it opened me up to feeling better about removing some of them as well. So hopefully that answered the question. I will stop sharing, and there will be a whole hour dedicated to those types of tools. And in the chat, I dropped in a link to the invasive plant control database, which I think is a really helpful database. I'll see if we have time, I can do a little demo of that as well. But there was a question in the chat around management.
Angie, I also put in the chat for the Fridays with a Forester, and Angie's presentation on iNaturalist and other tools that you can use to observe nature is April 16th. So there's actually the same page to register for the Forest Pest Person Detector lessons or Zooms are on the same page and that link.
Thank you, Gary. I've really appreciated you dropping those links in.
I did want to follow up just quickly, Jason, and maybe Monica, your thoughts on this too. Best buckthorn control measures for small infestations, 5 acres or less. I did drop in, we had one of the projects that Monica mentioned was we did a survey of asking people before we did a lot of modeling efforts to think about, what invasive species are a problem, how do you manage them, costs and effectiveness. And just a couple of highlights for buckthorn specifically, 72% of people said that herbicide was extremely or very effective for buckthorn. 50% said that manual removal of buckthorn was extremely or very effective. 23% said that mechanical removal of buckthorn was extremely or very effective. So that was a survey of a large, from private woodland owners to natural resource professionals that contributed to that. Angie or Monica, any other thoughts on buckthorn control?
I think it's worth mentioning the extension videos about soybean aphid and buckthorn. And there's a really terrific video, and Gary Wyatt, who's on this call, stars in it, about controlling buckthorn. So it's really neat because it demonstrates techniques like cut and treat buckthorn. So for small infestations, looking at something like cutting and treating buckthorn or basal bark treatments can be a very effective way to go. Oftentimes when removing the larger buckthorn plants, there's that flush of buckthorn seedlings, and then you might want to follow up with foliar treatments of those seedlings. So I don't know if that covers the answer to the question. Angie, do you want to talk some about the extension videos, or Gary, and perhaps put a link in the chat or send it out after the fact?
Yeah, so I do think I dropped in a link to the chat. So the extension videos are on that webpage. But then someone also mentioned that there's a cheat sheet, if you will, for some of these things. And I suspect that is this. So I'm dropping it into the chat right now. And I can quickly share my screen and show you both of these things, if that seems helpful. Okay, so this is the extension. So it is under common buckthorn. The videos are appropriate to both common and glossy, but it's identification tools, lots of great stuff. And then we have the videos. So there's actually 4. Tangled ecosystems is a big, broad overview of just how complicated all of these things are. And then you have specifics to identification, first steps to management, and second steps to management. And in first and second steps to management, they talk about some ways in which to prioritize invasive species and ways in which to think about them a little bit more holistically, and that is all drawn from the information on this website, which I also dropped into the chat link. This was developed years ago for the Master Naturalist program, but there's some great videos about how to lead volunteers in invasive species removal projects, if that's something you're likely to do. But then there are also these tools. So this is a project tool if you're going to do a volunteer activity to remove invasive species. This is prioritizing invasive plants. I just do want to give a little shout out to this. So if you have a property with multiple invasive plants or invasive plants at multiple stages of infestation, this can be really useful. And this, at the bottom of page 3, I like this little chart here. It can really help you to just think about where to prioritize your management, and recognizing that the management approach might change depending upon where you are on the landscape, right? So a little infestation will be treated differently than a big infestation, and you might have various layers of this overlapping for various species. So I think that is a really good resource. Sorry, meant to go back this way. This is potentially what folks were talking about as well. So this is a matrix that was designed. It's hard to read, so I'll just describe it a little bit, and you can find it on that link I've dropped into the chat. But there are some really common invasive species, buckthorn, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, that you may be dealing with, right? Garlic mustard. And then it just lays out the timing of different treatments and the chemical applications to make it a little easier. Like buckthorn and honeysuckle can pretty easily be treated together. So if you have both of those, it can work nicely. The same with multiflora rose. This is not comprehensive, but it can be a good way to think about it, and to see if you can be most strategic when you're invasive plant management. So with that, I will stop sharing the screen and see if there are any other questions.
I saw one going back a little ways from Doreen asking about olive, and I think this is Russian olive. In the past year, I'm starting to see olive on my property that we've been removing. Any word on that? You're muted, Monica.
Thank you for the reminder. I'm wondering if that's autumn olive, because that's what we're seeing moving more in Minnesota. And again, if we could get reports of naturalizing autumn olive, that would be helpful for doing risk assessments. So, so we're interested if there are naturalizing autumn olive, and I'm guessing that's what it is. That Russian olive we just haven't heard about naturalizing in Minnesota. If that's happening, we would also want to know that. So we're quite interested in what's happening out there, and there's no way that a small group of people could really keep track of what's happening. So getting reports is really, really helpful.
And so I'll jump in here. I'm sharing my screen again. I also suspect it is autumn olive, and so this. So one, report it to EdMaps through the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. That is the recommendation. But this is how you use this database if it's helpful. So if you have it and you've reported it, but you think you want to manage it because you don't want it on your property, this is just one example, but autumn olive is in this database. You can pick if you're a novice or what forest type is. So I'm just going to say yes. Well, I'm going to say you guys are not novices. So no, I'm not a novice. Yes, it's a forest. I want to do it in the summer. And of course, you can change all of these features. But then it is going to tell you all kinds of interesting things. So sometimes there are case studies. There are actually several case studies for buckthorn. There are none here. And then it tells you for the non-chemical applications, you can mow, how that works, its efficacy in season and afterwards. So mowing doesn't work very well, but it can be done by a novice. Prescribed burn, that has to be done by a professional. It works well in season, doesn't work great afterwards. So the same sort of approach. So this is removal. It can be done by a novice. It works well in season and fairly well out of season. It does talk about plant size though. So you get the idea. This is girdling. And then there's a whole typically a lengthy section about chemical applications. So foliar has to be done by a professional. It works well in season, even better afterwards. And then you can see its active name and its common name that you would find and purchase, your rates, timing, remarks, and cautions. And it's that way for every single one. So you see on the left, I'm going to scroll down, but there are foliar and lots of foliar for autumn olive, but then there's cut stump. You can see that. You can do professional and novice. It has pretty good efficacy. Here are your rates. So it keeps going. Again, lots of these, and it's for many different species. So that's my little shout out to that tool. I will pause. And frankly, we are getting close to our hour. So I will pitch it to Matt to see if there's one last question. Otherwise, I can kind of close out a little bit.
Yeah, I just added the link for the evaluation. We do want to hear your feedback on this webinar. And also if you have CFE requests for SAF or some of the other programs, you can use that form to do that. Again, a reminder, put your name on the form if you're asking for credits. That way we know who to give the credits to. Otherwise, it'd be great that you fill out the evaluation, but wouldn't know who. The other question I see here is from Katie about goat grazing. What about goat grazing to control buckthorn? Any studies on the effectiveness of that?
It's another really interesting topic area. Goats are very appealing, and there's so much interest in using goats for woody invasive control. And there's a project right now that's underway at the University of Minnesota at the Terrestrial Invasive Plants and Pest Center on goats and grazing for invasive plant control. So that will be very helpful to get hard data on how effective goats are or what situations are most effective in for buckthorn control. So there are some different operations that are out there that have had some good success, and it'll also be nice to get research that will provide more guidance. But that's a hot topic. There's so much interest in goats. Yeah, thank you.
And I just dropped in a chat. So one of the case studies under buckthorn in the invasive plant control database is about goats. So it is a case study. So it has not been peer reviewed necessarily or repeated, but it does tell you how it went for them. So I dropped that link in as well. And Gary dropped in a link about the Mitt Pit project.
Yeah, well, Angie, I don't see any more questions unless anyone has a last minute one. So I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. So with that, I will close this out. I appreciate everyone coming. I have a final slide. I maybe won't actually switch it over, but I don't want to forget what it says. So I just want to give a shout out to our next presentation. This Coffee and Chat with Forest Pest First Detectors will be April 14th, same time, 10 to 11, or, 9 to 10. That is a Wednesday. And it will be about spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So with those closing remarks, please don't forget to fill out your evaluation, add your name in the comment if you want a CEU. And thanks a ton for coming today. It was great to have everyone.